All right. Welcome to my favorite hour of the week during pandemic times, NYPAPy Hour, the happy hour for historic preservationists. It is so great to see all of you here tonight. We are really looking forward to having a great conversation about the preservation or the lack thereof of the industrial waterfront in New York City. Now, as we were preparing for this evening's chat, we realized there are probably 5 different programs under the umbrella of that heading. And we may have to have some supplemental programs to cover it all. But we are going to do our best tonight to dive in and get into the history of various preservation efforts to try to preserve and keep intact some sense of the history, the sense of place that goes with the built environment that makes up New York City's industrial waterfront. Now, my name is Brad Vogel, and I am the Executive Director of the New York Preservation Archive Project. Our whole goal is to tell the story of the preservation movement, so this is right in our wheelhouse. But I'm joined tonight by some fascinating people, and I can't wait to tell you a little bit more about them. Some of you may know them quite well already, but before we do that, I wanted to also say thank you to our sponsor this evening, and that is Jan Herd Picorni. So thank you so much for making this possible. We are now going to tell you the cast of characters for tonight's conversation. We have some people who have been hanging around the waterfront for just a little while. So Mary, Nathan, and Tom, if you're muted, feel free to unmute yourself. I want to start out by mentioning someone who has participated in our Preservation Film Festival in the past. He is a filmmaker and a photo essayist, Nathan Kensinger. He's been documenting New York City's changing industrial waterfront for the last 15 years. A series of exhibits, documentary films, public art installations, and more than 250 photo essays. Some of his projects include The Forgotten City, a video installation about the history of the Greenpoint Terminal Market, and you'll be hearing more about that soon. Projected onto the side of the market, and the Newtown Creek Armada, a remote-controlled boat pond created on the Newtown Creek, and his upcoming short film, Urban Growth, which was filmed inside Admiral's Row over the last decade. So Nathan, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Cheers. I got a glass of water for happy hour.
Yes. And we will have a toast here in a moment. So if you don't have your beverage in hand, feel free to go grab that, because once we're done with the intros, we can't start the program without some kind of a toast. You know, people say it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Well, it's also 5:50 somewhere, and that somewhere is here. Our next contestant, so to speak, joining us, someone who I have grown to know well over years here in New York, Mary Habstritt, who is currently the museum director and president of the Lilac Preservation Project, a maritime museum that has been restoring America's only surviving steam-powered lighthouse tender. And Mary has also served as the president of the Society for Industrial Archaeology, SIA or SIA. But this is not where you go when you're looking for a chandelier. This is industrial archaeology, a different SIA. Now, she has also served in several positions with SIA, including the local Rabling chapter, which has been advocating for industrial heritage sites in New York and New Jersey. And her devotion to history and preservation stems from her career as an academic librarian. She has a master's degree from Columbia University School of Library Service. So Mary, welcome.
Thanks. I have whiskey.
Very apropos for this evening. And our last panelist this evening, and really these are not panelists, these are conversationalists, if you will. I can see already we have some questions too. I'm really looking forward to the questions this evening. I see some very fun folks in the audience here from all different walks of life around the city, so looking forward to that. But first, Thomas Rinaldi. Tom, it's very difficult to come up with a description for you, somewhere off past Renaissance man. But Tom is an author, an architectural designer. He is a man who learns of ancient vessels that are about to go defunct and be taken offline in the Indian Ocean, and takes a trip to get on that boat and take the last voyage and document that experience. Tom has also worked extensively with New York neon signage, and with industrial heritage in the Hudson Valley. There's so much more I could say, but Tom, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so at this point, if you have your beverage handy, this being a happy hour, I invite you to join me in a toast to New York City's historic waterfront. Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. Now, first things first, before we jump into our conversation, I see a private message has come across asking me, what is your shirt? Now, I will adjust my screen here a little bit, and Mary, you too should show yours off, because you are wearing the same t-shirt. This is a bit of paraphernalia or ephemera left over from the fight to save the Austin Nichols warehouse. Now, again, we'll get into that very shortly here. I myself was not involved in that fight. Mary was.
184 Kent Street.
Yes, exactly. Carol, thank you so much for that. In Williamsburg. Egyptian revival, interestingly enough. But again, we'll get to that soon. I wanted to also note that we have a special guest here among special guests. And that is, I believe, if I'm seeing things right here, is that Greg Young from the Bowery Boys?
Yes. Hi.
Welcome.
Hi. How are you?
Doing very well. Thanks. Great to see you on a Friday.
No. I've been. This is wonderful. I'm finally got to be here for a happy hour. So, cheers.
Excellent.
Cheers.
And I hope you'll chime in when we get to Red Hook, Greg, because I know you have taken an active interest in some of the industrial waterfront sites there.
Yes, Red Hook has saved my life in the past couple months since I can't go anywhere and I live right next to it. So I've had a lot of time to study Red Hook in the past. So we'll get to that later.
Wunderbar. All right. Well, let's jump in. You know, we're going to go down the coast of Brooklyn to start things out, just because there have been so many preservation-related issues and fights along that shoreline of New York City's 520 miles of waterfront. So I wanted to start out with Nathan and just ask you, could you give us a bit of background briefly on the Greenpoint Terminal Market?
Sure. I'm not the greatest at, dates and names, but I have written about the history of the Greenpoint Terminal Market. But for those who don't know, the Greenpoint Terminal Market was a huge warehouse complex on the waterfront of Greenpoint that a large portion of burnt to the ground in a suspicious fire in 2006, I believe it was. If I got that date wrong, let me know. But prior to burning to the ground, it had been abandoned for quite a long time and became known as the Forgotten City. Because its huge open warehouse spaces were taken over by squatters and by artists doing kind of crazy art installations and by parties happening at night. The longer history dates back to the 1800s, when it was used to produce rope and jute, and it was the American Manufacturing Company for a very long time. So it has this really colorful, long history that kind of traces back through many different eras of New York City. And of course, it's burning. When it was burned, a lot of that history was destroyed. There are still some sections remaining, though, along the waterfront, although a good portion of the whole complex was demolished during the fire.
It had incredible sky bridges across
Yeah.
Avenue to connect different parts of the complex, and the fire department pulled those down, fearing that they would fall.
Yeah, and I'll actually share an image of that. One moment here. Just get this set up. You're getting a sneak preview of another building that actually suffered from fire, but more on that soon.
Yeah, fires could be something mentioned more than once.
Yes.
That's still standing. That section of the warehouse is still standing.
So just to give people context, this is in Greenpoint along the waterfront.
Yes. And there were some tenants in there.
That was post-fire.
A used clothing used clothing seller. So after the fire, there was a huge amount of wet clothing that smoldered and moldered for months afterwards.
Yeah, I have some great photos of that. This is one of my photos from after the fire, when a lot of the warehouses were destroyed. But yeah, there was these huge mountains of clothes. I went into the building after it burned and documented kind of what was inside in the weeks after the fire. And then I went again years later and documented the remaining warehouses as well. Yeah, that was post.
One of those sky bridges there.
Yeah, that's since been demolished along with that entire building. But yeah, it was one of the largest industrial complexes remaining on the waterfront of Brooklyn before it burned, and still is considerable in size. But before it burned, there were definitely calls to landmark it, and that's why people were suspicious about the fire, is that it came right after people started putting pressure on to try and landmark some aspect of it.
Very interesting.
This is easy to spot because of its big water tower, am I right? Is it still there?
The water tower is still there, yeah. And they've turned some of the buildings into artist studios and shops, and now I think residential. One of the buildings that was completely abandoned before the fire and after the fire has become, I think, residential, but definitely huge glass windows that they put in on some of the buildings.
And no portion of the complex was ever ultimately landmarked, right?
No, nothing there is landmarked. Yeah. The buildings are still, that are still standing are still pretty impressive, but not landmarked.
Got it. All right, so let's move our way on down to the building that we mentioned about with the shirts, the Austin Nichols warehouse. And Mary, did you want to chime in on this?
Sure. One of the significant things about it is that it was designed by Cass Gilbert. So we actually got a lot of sympathy from the Landmarks Commission. Mary Beth Betts, who was the director of research, was a Cass Gilbert scholar. So we actually had a lot of support from the Preservation Commission. I was called by a tenant in the building. It was already a residential building when the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning happened, but the owner of the building felt he wasn't making enough money, and it's a very deep building. He wanted to cut a light court through the center, and to make up for the loss of that space, add stories to the building. And he had gone to the Board of Standards and Appeals to try to get a hardship decision so that he could go forward with that. And they wouldn't buy it, but he just dropped the whole application when the rezoning went through because he'd be able to do it as of right. But those of us trying to preserve it, we're working simultaneously on getting it determined eligible for the National Register, as well as applying to the Landmarks Commission. New York City landmarks law is much stronger, but it's a little more political. And the city council member was against the landmarking. So it got approved by the Landmarks Commission, vetoed by the city council. The veto was overridden by Mayor Bloomberg. It went back to the city council. They overrode the veto. And so it did not get landmarked, but we got it determined eligible for the register, and the owner needed a new financial partner. And as soon as the financial partner realized preservation tax credits were available, they applied for that, where the renovations would be overseen by the National Park Service. So it was a much more sympathetic addition. They did put an addition on top, but it is a success story, but in a lot of ways it kind of happened by accident. If that financial partner had not wanted the tax credits, I don't think it would have been saved.
Okay,
So Mary, this was never landmarked?
Well, I think that's an important distinction to draw out, is that it is possible for the Landmarks Preservation Commission to designate a building as an individual city landmark. And then what people forget, because the newspapers often report it as having been landmarked, but it still has to go through at least one, if not two, committees of the city council and then get approved by the city council itself. And sometimes this happens sort of way after the fact of the LPC action, and people forget that that cloud is still hovering out there. And so there's different terms used, sort of it's been de-designated by the city council, or some people view it as it never got landmarked because it didn't go all the way through the process. But this is one of the examples where the city council chimed in and ultimately reversed the Landmarks Preservation Commission.
So it's not currently a landmark either.
That's correct. It's really protected by the preservation easement, which was entered into by the property owner, is my understanding. Now, Tom, is this you in this photo?
That's me.
Huh.
Back in
Nice.
the era of baggy clothing and unrestricted access to the top of the oil tanks that stood next to this thing.
Very nice.
Good old days.
Good old days. Nice.
Now, I just want to point out one feature before we move along here, and that is, and I mentioned it in the chat, is that if you look here where I'm drawing with the red arrow, the building from the street level looks like a very mundane structure, certainly leaning out of sort of the time of ornament and into a more streamlined, modern period of architecture. But at the top here, it does have and I don't know how to pronounce this probably, but cavuto cornice, that is sort of this concave cornice that is indicative of the Egyptian revival style. So, he seemingly, Cass Gilbert, had an awareness of the fact that Egyptian revival was often used for these sort of large institutional type buildings, whether that was the Tombs, the old police station in New York City, or the reservoir for the that occupied the site of what is today Bryant Park. That was done in a sort of loosely Egyptian revival style. So it seems that there are echoes of earlier New York City architecture coming through ever so subtly in this building.
My understanding is that if you were to take a level and hold it vertically up against one of the facades of this building, you would find that they are not vertical.
Right. And
right? They're just, they cant inward slightly before they kick out at that cornice, right?
Right. And that's another, that's another aspect. Another aspect of Egyptian revival is the battered walls where they slope inward like that. So anyway, your daily architectural styles note, but let's move on along down the East River. Oh, what is this? Domino.
Good old Domino.
Does it look like that today?
Oh.
Unfortunately, no. I think it's interesting. I mean, Mary mentioned the idea of some of these places being success stories, and I'm curious what people think about the Domino Sugar Refinery, because part of it was landmarked, but the majority of the complex was torn to the ground and demolished. So I wonder, how do people view that? Is the Domino a success story, or is the Domino a story of destruction and demolition?
Leaves me with a very cynical feeling towards landmarking in New York to look at what's happened to this building now, where, it's been completely stripped down to everything that could possibly have been removed and destroyed, down to the very last little bit of what was legally protected.
Right. So I'm just drawing, Tom, along those lines with a green pen here, what I think is the actual designated portion of the complex. Now, even within that,
part of that,
this part has all been taken out in the front, stuck out towards the river. Right?
I think the tanks have been reused in the park, which I've not been able to bring myself to go look at. But what they saved was, although it looks like one mass, it's actually 3 buildings. But if you look at the entire complex, and depending how you count things like the tanks, there were 26 structures on the site. So they saved about 3-4%.
And the part that they saved is really just the exterior, which I think they talked about wrapping in like a wall of glass,
Right.
but they've completely gutted the building. I went by it not too long before all of this pandemic business, and the entire inside of that green circle was gutted. So you could see through the entire building all the way out to the other side. So they really just saved like the exterior wall and nothing else, which was interesting. I mean, the Domino Sugar Factory was also one of the most major industrial complexes still remaining on the waterfront. And I did wonder how they could save those buildings and repurpose them without having to just crack the building open and gut them. Because inside that building that they did save was basically just floor after floor of sugar refinery equipment. There were no actual like floors proper. It was sort of like, uppers and all sorts of devices funneling the sugar down through into the basements of the building. So it was an amazing structure. I wandered around it for a couple days after it had been shuttered and took a lot of photographs, but it was an amazing structure to wander through and try and figure out how it was still standing even. Well,
and we talked about this a little before the all of our guests came in, but yes, that was the building where the sugar was originally unloaded. Ships would pull up outside and unload what they called raw sugar, which was partially processed at the plantation because the carbohydrates in the sugar cane degrade very quickly. And they would unload it here and start the process. So this is the raw sugar warehouse where this sculpture was put. And I also couldn't bring myself to go see that.
That's interesting. I made myself go see that installation by Kara Walker, and then I also made myself go look at the park. And I wrote a couple kind of, I don't want to say scathing, but I wrote a couple fairly critical photo essays about both of them. Just looking at like what was lost, neither the Kara Walker installation nor the park really is a honest tribute to the history of the Domino Sugar Refinery and to the hundreds and thousands of workers who, spent their lives working there, to its place in the community.
Yes,
they're really
it
not
was once the world's
acknowledged.
largest sugar refinery. Greenpoint Terminal Market was once the largest rope manufacturer. American manufacturing was the largest rope manufacturer. So one thing, you're talking about New York City, and you keep coming up with the biggest, the best, the world's largest. It's actually pretty crazy that things that were so significant once are not considered important anymore. We've lost a lot of infrastructure because of that.
Kara Walker was such a tease to me because, it seemed like such a celebration of that building, which was not part of the landmark protected portion of the complex. And it seemed like such a demonstration of the potential for industrial buildings on the waterfront. And the place was mobbed, and it was this cathedral-like space with this ethereal light that was, so obviously well suited for this great public use. But it wasn't a celebration. It was kind of like even to call it a last hurrah is giving it too much credit, because as soon as that exhibit closed, the bulldozers moved in and the whole thing is completely gone now. So, to me, it was really, again, I can't, that whole episode of Domino's makes one very cynical. This is what we're now.
That's a good shot of,
yeah,
you can see through that entire building. Yeah,
one of the interesting things during the preservation battle, the developer that bought it from Domino Sugar had to get the site rezoned for residential development because it had been carved out of the Greenpoint Williamsburg overall rezoning because it was still operating. They wanted to preserve the jobs. And when we had the hearing at Landmarks, and the word on the street was that the reason Landmarks was only considering the 3 central refinery buildings was because Deputy Mayor Daniel Doctoroff biked by and went, "Whoa, these buildings are cool." And that's what, they wouldn't even talk about the other structures, right? And the developer bussed these church groups into the Landmarks Preservation Commission hearings and gave them all matching shirts, paid for the buses. They were from church groups that were advocating for housing and having affordable housing as part of the complex. And because they'd been bussed in, the Landmarks Commission allowed them all to speak first. Usually they alternate pro and con speakers, but because they had to get on their bus and leave, all the anti-preservation people got to speak first. So by the time they got to we preservationists, the press had left. we looked like bad people because they had said, you know, it's an evil site because once Domino used slaves to grow their sugar cane. And it's like, wow. To me, history is neutral, and we should preserve the good along with the bad, or we forget about the bad too.
Right.
So you know, it was
Mary. You bring
really
up
incredible.
you bring up an interesting point about LPC and testimony. I have not paid close enough attention, but in its current form, where it's taking Zoom-based or online-based testimony, are there reporters who are actively present covering what's happening?
I don't know.
And maybe
so
that's
I'm concentrated on just the ship I'm working on now. I haven't been to one in a long time.
Right. No, that's more of a question I guess I'll throw out to the chat, is if anyone out there has participated or watched the LPC hearings since they launched online, and whether there's any indication, whether in this online forum itself or in reportage that comes of it, that reporters are actually there. Just looking at how different construction of the testimony process actually impacts preservation or the lack thereof. But let's move on from here in Williamsburg to this site. Now, I have this strange feeling that Andrew and Cindy, who I believe are on from Turnstile Tours, might have a thing or two to say about this. If you'd like to unmute, please tell us what this is.
It's a landmark.
Whoop. Start the video.
Yep, go right ahead.
It's Dry Dock 1.
Now, what is Dry Dock 1?
So this is so historically the Brooklyn Navy Yard had 6 working dry docks for ship construction and repair. And so this is the oldest one, built between 1841 and 1851. And Dry Dock 1 is a landmark. So it's one of only 3 New York City landmark structures on the Navy Yard property.
Okay.
What are the other two?
The other 2 is the Naval Hospital and the Surgeon's House. So they're both up in the southeast corner at the former Naval Hospital. Yeah. And then, of course, the Surgeon's
landmark, the Paymaster building.
Yeah. I mean, the Commandant's House is also landmark, and that's a National Historic Landmark, but that's now technically private property. The Navy sold that building back in 1979, so it's a private home. But there are 3 that are still within the complex of the Navy Yard.
Now,
so they still use this for ship repair. There's a ship in it right now, I'm pretty sure.
It's a beautiful structure. I mean, it's really an amazing piece of work. This is a photo I took standing down in the bottom of the dry dock. But if you get a chance to go on one of the tours by Turnstile Tours, you can look down into the dry dock from above, and it's just a really it's fantastic. It's landmarked because it is such a beautiful piece of architecture. Really, I mean, it's functional, but it's just a beautiful thing.
And the graving dock itself is actually landmarked?
It is.
Yep.
It is. And just for background, you know, it's a graving dock, not just a dry dock. So it's actually built into the land, which is significant. But I'm also mentioning that because we're going to be talking about another graving dock, believe it or not, which is most decidedly not landmarked.
It's buried.
Yes. All right. Well, let's move right along. Thanks again, Andrew and Cindy from Turnstile Tours. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. It's great.
Okay. So we're moving on down along the East River here. Perhaps you feel like you're on a ferry right now, moving on down the water. What is this structure here, Tom?
The Hudson Avenue Power Plant.
Mm-hmm.
And that is
That
still
it
a
had-
functioning plant, right?
What's that?
That is still a functioning plant, correct?
Well, I suspect someone else in the chat probably has more up-to-date information than I do. It is still operating in some capacity, but I don't think power is actually being generated here anymore. I don't know, but it's still Con Ed. Still there, minus its smokestacks.
They took the smokestacks down? Yeah.
They took 3 down and left 1, and then at some point in the last few years, they took the last one down too.
Oh, crazy.
But it's from the 1920s, and it's a little older than the 14th Street power plant in Manhattan, on the Manhattan side of the river. It's one of the very last kind of great intact examples of a big waterfront power plant that you can still see, and I sort of wonder what will become of it, but it seems like what's left of it is being eroded all the time. So
now the ferry is skipping over its stop at Fulton Ferry at the Brooklyn Bridge. It's skipping over all of Dumbo and all of Brooklyn Bridge Park, which are whole other preservation stories unto themselves, multiple stories. But we're going to jump on down to this next structure. Now, does anyone in the chat recognize what this building is or was? I'm seeing the chat say crickets, crickets, crickets.
It's in Red Hook. I could give you a hint. It's in Red Hook.
That's a good clue, Nathan.
Right by Valentino Pier Park.
Yeah. Oh, this is part of Lidgerwood, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, Nathan, you want to give us a little background on this?
Oh man, I got to go get my notes on Lidgerwood if I'm going to do that. But this is
tell you about Lidgerwood.
Yeah.
I
wrote an article about this one too.
Lidgerwood, capstan on it. So Lidgerwood made hoists, particularly for the mining industry, and various kinds of winches and lifting machinery. Like I said, I have a capstan on my ship that was made by Lidgerwood in Elizabeth, New Jersey, but they had sites all over the country, and the company still exists under a slightly changed name, Superior Lidgerwood in Superior, Wisconsin.
The complex itself was like a whole city block complex of warehouses that was quite beautiful. And I got inside and took some photos of the interior, which was an amazing structure as well, with wood beams and these narrow catwalks tracing through the inside of the building. Unfortunately, most of it was demolished to make way for a UPS truck facility for last mile trucking. And that happened just last year. So what you're looking at now is completely gone. The community was able to stop the demolition when maybe like 1/4 or 1/5 of the complex remained, but pretty much all of the structure was demolished. I think it dated back to 18. Oh geez, I'd have to get the notes, but it's from the late 1800s.
I'm gonna say 80.
Yeah, 1880s, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful structure on the outside, but also the inside, which is another thing I would say, like, we're talking about historic preservation, and a lot of these structures, even if they are landmarked, it doesn't provide any protection for the interior. And the interior, to me, is often what's even more remarkable, like seeing the wood beams inside Lidgerwood and another building we'll look at later, the Bowne warehouses. It's just amazing to be inside these spaces. Domino also, like the Domino Sugar Refinery, the interior was just an amazing structure to wander through. And so when you landmark something and you just save the exterior wall, or in the case of Lidgerwood, they're going to save one wall or rebuild one wall and replace the rest of the parking lot for UPS. It's a nod towards preservation, but it's really just like facadism. That's what I call it. It's like,
was this building ever seriously considered for landmarking?
I don't know if it was ever taken all the way through the landmarking board, but it definitely was something that was written about by, I think, the Historic Districts Council, included it in some of their reports. So it's definitely had its history researched and was considered to be a historic space worth preserving.
Mm-hmm. Now, Red Hook does not have very many designated individual landmarks.
One industrial one.
I think it has one, right? Which is, maybe we have it here, the clay retort, right? No.
Yeah, I sent a photo of it along.
Alas,
I did
not
a photo
include
of it along.
Yeah. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a stone factory that was, it's still used for manufacturing glass, that was built to make fire brick.
Yeah,
But
it's unfortunate. Red Hook, there's a lot of great structures like this here that could be landmarked very easily in Red Hook, but
And
there's only one industrial site.
the Fairway building is not landmarked either.
It is
No.
not.
None of the O'Connell properties are landmarked.
And the Fairway building has had quite a few alterations, many more openings cut into it than there were originally.
Yeah, this is the Beard Street Piers here, and that is in very good sort of original condition. I don't think they cut too many extra spaces in that. But I mean, all along the waterfront of Red Hook, there's a lot of properties owned by the O'Connell family or the O'Connell organization that could very easily be landmarked and preserved. But the family has done a great job of preserving them on their own and not giving in to the temptation to tear them down and redevelop them into glass boxes.
Mary,
Yeah.
can you say anything about that style of warehouse that was just in the last slide that you find in the New York water,
Yeah.
really the Brooklyn waterfront, from like Sunset Park as far up as Navy Yard?
Yeah, yeah, it's a classic Brooklyn style warehouse. It's rather unique to Brooklyn, and I have a paper done by a historian from the National Park Service about them. But they had hoists above those arched openings so that they could lift bulk cargo off of ships in slings in through the doors of the warehouse, and the shutters were for fire safety. Back when these were built in the 19th century, obviously fire was a big concern.
And they have these massive like cast iron keystones, don't they?
I don't know about those, but you'll see on this one, and they're often star-shaped, you'll see tie rods that hold each floor to the brick walls. It's actually an indication of the age of the building. Yeah.
They're sort of Civil War era when you see them, right?
Yes, they are
Yeah.
Civil War era. Yeah.
And actually, a number had been torn down. There was actually one in Brooklyn Bridge Park that had been interestingly converted in the early 20th century to a refrigeration plant and still had original refrigeration machinery in it. And I know the archaeologist who was asked to evaluate the significance of the plant was not allowed to look closely at the machinery. He was sort of marched through really fast. And the park has reused some of the wooden beams from that building for benches in the park, and very proud of reusing them.
So let's go just a little further, and now we're going into what is known as the Erie Basin. This is a basin built to handle a lot of the vessel traffic that was coming down the Erie Canal from the interior, then down the Hudson and ending up in New York, and then transferred oftentimes for shipment around the world. So, very much entwined with the story that made New York the grand commercial metropolis that it is. But Mary, what are we looking at here?
Well, that's graving dock number 1 in Red Hook. And like you said, a graving dock is built into the shore. There are dry docks that float even and can be sunk and then lift a ship up out of the water. But the main thing is that a graving dock is one kind of dry dock, and they're made to lift ships out of the water so that they can be repaired and repainted. So a significant piece of waterfront infrastructure. This is now under the Ikea parking lot. Suddenly going blank on the name I'm trying to bring forth. But the preservation director at the Municipal Art Society at the time called it, and they marked the outline with Belgian block in the parking lot, that she called it the outline of a homicide.
Yeah, I think I have a photo of that somewhere too that I sent along. But yeah, that was a sad one. I mean, I was inside this one, I think, not in the other graving dock that you showed, but it was a really just amazing structure. You're standing like 60 feet below the the sea level, and you can
Yes,
just imagine the enormous ships that were repaired there. And the what was also destroyed, this is the Todd Shipyard, but what was also destroyed there by the Ikea was not just the functioning, working dry docks and graving docks, but a whole collection of beautiful Civil War era warehouses along Beard Street that were completely bulldozed as well.
Yeah, so there once were 2 graving docks. One was filled in the 1970s already, but the one that is now under the parking lot was still being used when the site was rezoned. It was being leased to a ship repair company that wanted to buy the dry dock from Ikea, but Ikea would not subdivide the site. It was one of the largest parcels left in the city.
Yeah, and I've never seen that parking lot full. You can go there on any day, and the Ikea parking lot is just a large open field of asphalt, and then the very sad outline and blocks of where the dry dock used to be.
I won't go to that IKEA. It's on my boycott list because of that.
I refuse to go to that IKEA also. Yeah.
I love those people as much as anybody, but I won't sit.
The only thing I've done there is use their bathroom.
I did
go take pictures of the park once. I went to the park and did a photo essay that was critical of the park again. I've written a lot of critical things about it. In the background there, you can see the old red warehouses that line Beard Street. But
so as it looked
beautiful
when Ikea got clutches on it and ruined it. But the unfortunate thing was Municipal Art Society, I thought, was great in advocating for trying to broker a deal where this working shipyard that needed this actually sort of critical infrastructure could have coexisted with IKEA, and you would have had a kind of a nice little symbiotic relationship there, it seemed to me, but IKEA just wasn't interested. And so now it's...
Well, New York, New York City, after they demolished this, New York City came out with a report that they actually needed more working shipyards in the New York City area, and like that to replace this very, dry dock that they destroyed would cost like, I don't know, like hundreds of millions for like $1 billion. Yeah. It's not, you can't replace this kind of structure once you've destroyed it. It's not, you can't just go find another waterfront site to build a dry dock.
Wasn't it filled in such a way that it could be excavated?
Well, that was
it's still a parking lot.
But John Quadrosi, who got, was mentioned in our pre-event chat, he filled the entire thing with concrete. It was eligible for the National Register, and the Army Corps of Engineers actually tried to say that as long as the dry dock was not filled with water, it was outside of the area of potential effect, which is a legal definition for what can be considered historic and stuff, that will be affected by the project. And we actually joked about pulling the case on That's the Gate at the end out, getting in some boats and cutting it free and flooding the dock. But we did not do that. It was filled with concrete, which I think is not so reversible. It was supposed to be filled in a reversible way.
That would be hard to take out, yeah.
So
the last below ground dry docks in the city are at the Navy Yard. I mean, they're floating dry docks in Staten Island, but the last ones in New York City are last active shipyard is at the
the ones in the Navy Yard, the access is somewhat restricted for larger ships because they can't get underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. If
Right.
Well,
and there's one of those is landmarked, but the rest of the GMD shipyard and the Brooklyn Navy Yard is not landmarked, although those are amazing structures too.
Right. And I see Andrew and Cindy have noted that larger ships actually have to go over to Bayonne, New Jersey to use facilities there. So, but let's turn from dry docks and graving docks to fire once again, because it seems to have this strange habit of licking up against buildings along the waterfront. Now, what are we viewing here?
Should we say, or do you want people to guess?
People in the, if you saw our email blast today, you probably know what this is already, but does anyone in the chat know what this is, what we're viewing right here? I will give you a clue. It's a tragic scene.
And it's on the Gowanus.
It's at the mouth of the Gowanus Canal. Ah, yes, the Bowne warehouse fire. So the S.W. Bowne Grain Storehouse, 1886. This is actually after that fire. And so you can see that the building still actually looked in maybe salvageable state. But it's very interesting because, like was mentioned earlier, this fire happened just days, if not hours, after preservationists met with a city council staff person to discuss moving forward with an effort to landmark the structure.
Yeah, that was another sad one. I mean, yeah, my connection to a lot of these structures is, I feel like, more personal than historical. Like, I try to visit all of these historic structures along Brooklyn's waterfront and New York's waterfront and spend time in them and document them. And the inside of the Bowne warehouse was another beautiful example of kind of this wood beam structure. There's a great picture of it.
Looks like
Yeah, this is on the upper
attic
floor.
of Notre Dame that you saw pictures of before. It's
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
this
Yeah,
was
like
kind
a
of
forest
unique.
of trees.
This was a unique building, wasn't it?
It was unique. Yeah,
Yes, now
it was one of the last of its kind remaining, for sure, along the waterfront of Brooklyn. But
right. So
also,
this burnt in 2018, and there was sort of an active preservation movement happening at that time to get it landmarked. But it was very interesting to note that back in 2009, a different group had actually already approached LPC and requested that it be landmarked. Mary, could you give us a hint about what that was?
Yeah, as the preservation chair of the Roebling chapter of the SIA, I wrote a letter advocating for its preservation. That was after I had worked on a project with the Municipal Art Society to declare the entire Brooklyn industrial waterfront one of the nation's 11 most endangered sites. And then read Charles Parrott's paper that I just mentioned about Brooklyn warehouses, and realizing that this was a somewhat unique example because of the pitched roof and elevating machinery for the grain. Yeah, it didn't go anywhere. They completely ignored it in that case.
And Mary, I'm just going to point out with the yellow pen here on screen what's called, I believe, the monitor.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, having come from Minnesota, where Minneapolis is the center of grain milling, I believe that housed a conveyor for sorting grain amongst different sections, bins in the warehouse.
And the building actually has an interesting little tie-in too with labor history, because S.W. Bowne himself owned the place, but also worked alongside the men on the various floors and injured himself pretty severely at one point. And there was a legal case that actually played into the history of workers' comp in New York State. So some interesting tie-ins. But let's move a little further up the Gowanus.
Did anyone mention what it looks like now?
There's one wall standing. Last time I was there, at least, and the entire thing has been demolished. I don't know if that wall is still standing. Actually, I haven't been over to the.
It was as of a
area.
few days ago, but yeah, that's about it. One part of one wall.
But yeah,
they're still
completely
working
bulldozed.
on it. A lot of construction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, this is a building that is known as locally as the Bat Cave along the Gowanus Canal. Now, this was the Brooklyn Rapid Transit powerhouse built around the turn of the century. And today it's covered in scaffolding and it's being preserved in the outside, and was designated last fall as a city individual landmark. To my knowledge, it has not yet passed the city council. So to go back to our other conversation, sort of never say never, process remains to play out on this one from everything I can tell.
This building had a twin that was demolished not that long ago.
That's right. On the back side, it actually rose slightly higher than this building that you see. And Herzog...
Oh, that's not what I meant. That's true. But there was another, the BRT built a twin power plant that was over by the Navy Yard.
Ah, okay.
That was, I think, still in use in some capacity by Con Ed, if I'm not mistaken. kind of in the vicinity of where the Navy Yard ferry dock is now. It was
The
almost
one,
a single building,
the one on the waterfront, South Williamsburg, has been gone for years.
but maybe 12 years.
Yeah, something like that. They were starting to demolish it. I got it designated for the National Register. Well, determined eligible, I should say, for the National Register, just as a PR move. But it was, his name's going to escape me now when I want it, but it was designed by a power plant engineer who was second only to Thomas Edison in the number of patents that he had received.
Oh.
And really magnificent, like 3-story high arched windows. Just amazing.
That's
Good
great
for
that
you,
the winner on Gowanus is landmarked though, or tentatively.
Yes. And the building that we can see on the screen right now, the Kuan-Yin Stone building, was part of a larger complex to make cast stone. This dates to the 1870s. And this one was landmarked. This was not landmarked with the suite of buildings that got individually designated last fall and pushed by the Gowanus Landmarking Coalition. This one was actually, I think, 2006, designated based on the interest of an LPC staff person who recognized its significance.
And I think like, a lot of the buildings we've looked at so far, that kind of last minute under the wire landmarking is the only reason it's still around.
Absolutely. And it's that, but there's no use for it, and nobody seems to know what anybody can do with it, and or what the marketing is about it. It's all a mystery.
Right.
It's kind of
now it's
gentrification in the
looking
Whole
at the
Foods
comments there. It's now completely crowded in by the Whole Foods. I don't know if Brad has it, but I have a great overhead shot looking down on the condition of what it used to look like. The building was completely alone in this enormous open lot that had turned into like
sort of a marsh.
And one of the comments,
overgrown.
Yeah, I had.
But now it's in very different condition than this. They've stripped away a lot of the fake brick that was plastered on the outside of it and revealed what was underneath, which is that the building is just a poured concrete. It's an example of what you can do with poured concrete. So the whole building is made out of concrete.
Well, Kuan-Yin Stone was, they were trying to showcase their product. They had an artificial stone product that was, I believe, also used on one of the arches in Central Park.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely in Prospect Park, the cleft span ridge over by the boathouse is all Kuan-Yin Stone, I know. Now, just to give people some context, if you follow this arrow I'm drawing up in the clouds here, back that way is an arm of the Gowanus Canal. So this whole complex was backing right onto the waterway for purposes of transporting goods.
I mean, speaking of businesses, I personally boycott. I don't go to the Whole Foods that's near there because it's built, with the canal on two sides on top of an extremely toxic brownfield. And I'm like, I don't really want to buy my organic groceries from a brownfield in a Superfund site. Like,
the members of this panel don't have very many places to shop, I'll say.
Yeah, you can't go to Ikea, can't go to Whole Foods there, can't go to a lot of places. Can't go to Domino Park.
Let's take a look at this one. This is an ice house and brewery complex also along the Gowanus Canal. And it had been part of the group that the Gowanus Landmarking Coalition had asked to have landmarked. But I know, and it says right here, but I'll just point it out, this is a multi-building complex. And this building here, you can't see, it had some pretty nice Art Deco.
They took that down?
details. That's gone as of certainly the last 6 months, if not the last 9 months, somewhere in that range.
Oh man, I gotta get over there and see that. I haven't been over to there in a few months. Yeah.
All right.
You go a few months and the place can look quite different.
So we're pushing further down.
Skipped a lot of the Gowanus. The Gowanus is one of the rare recent success stories.
Yes.
they landmarked some things in the Gowanus, which was pretty remarkable. I thought. I mean, considering Brooklyn's entire industrial waterfront has 4 or 5 landmarks or something. I mean, the fact that they would do a whole batch of them on the Gowanus was a pretty great achievement. I mean, I wish they would save the entire Gowanus and not rezone it and demolish it as they're going to and as they have been. But the fact that some of those buildings were saved was certainly pretty amazing.
Yep. I would have to put on a different hat to comment further on that. But I have to say I agree with you there.
I mean, yeah, given the lack of landmarking for industrial architecture across Brooklyn's waterfront, that they would say what 3 more structures is like, it's a huge amount compared to what we do have.
Well, and a general comment on that is I think it's been harder to convince at least the preservation community that industrial buildings are important, because they're usually not designed by architects, even though they might be really strikingly architectural. Like when we got the Brooklyn Industrial Waterfront listed on the 11 most endangered list, the National Trust really had a hard time wrapping their head around it because it wasn't beautiful architecture. And generally speaking, New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission has not been great about designating things for social significance. They have very much focused on things of architectural significance, which means you need a named architect.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I mean, many of these structures, as we've been talking about, are just remarkable structures inside and outside, and whether or not they're attached to like a famous architect's name or a known architect's name, it's like they have these amazing histories. They are these beautiful structures, and they tell so much about how New York became New York. Yeah. So to erase them, as we have been doing for like the last decade or two, just erasing them wholesale, is really just erasing the history of how Brooklyn became Brooklyn and how the waterfront of New York City was this vibrant place that really turned the city into what we know today.
And I know it's preaching to the choir here, but you don't have to look far at all to see the reuse potential of these buildings. I mean, especially in Europe, cities like Hamburg, have taken these buildings and, used them to make these incredibly distinctive, really livable waterfronts, just a great quality of life. And I mean, I look over across the East River now, and it's just this like wall of glass, and I don't know, it doesn't please me.
Yeah, the whole waterfront of Williamsburg and Greenpoint also.
Yeah, people were curious about these places, like what happened behind the walls. So I felt like being able to tell the story as part of the advocacy effort was really important. And it made a difference if people in the community remembered what happened there. Like in Williamsburg, the Domino Sugar plant had a lot more support from the community because there were still people living in the neighborhood who had worked there.
Right.
With Todd Shipyard in Red Hook, it had been mostly closed down for so long. And the people who were really looking forward to the Ikea jobs did not remember any kind of shipbuilding happening there. Even though the one dry dock was still working, it was a pretty small operation with no local employees. And so to them, it was just a derelict site with no meaning to them anymore, and they wanted the jobs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this one we're moving into is where the buildings are still around and have been reused, I think, not by virtue of any kind of landmark protection. Am I right?
Right.
Private development. Yeah, this is Industry City. Private developers have taken Industry City and turned it into something
Totally right,
else.
Tom.
Yes. Irving T. Bush Terminal. He had a concept of creating a factory environment for small manufacturers where you could rent just a floor or part of a floor or part of a building and still have all the facilities of a big manufacturing company. So it had rail service, it was on the waterfront, you could bring things in by ship things out, and have all the facilities that a big factory would have, even if you weren't big enough yet to build your own big factory.
Mm-hmm.
So there were kind of lofts for lease. Is that right?
Yes.
And what were some notable companies that leased space there?
That I could not tell you off the top of my head.
But Bush was basically a real estate company. In other words, they didn't make things.
Yeah. He was competing against the New York Dock Company, which had built most of those classic Brooklyn warehouses we were looking at earlier, and sort of walled off most of the waterfront and had a near monopoly. And then when he started competing with the New York Dock Company, the New York Dock Company built what is now known as One Brooklyn Bridge Park with the same concept. And that was designed by the same architect who built the Sterrett-Lehigh building. And I think he worked out some of his ideas in One Brooklyn Bridge Park, was then known as the Trade Facilities Building, where you could, it was the idea of a vertical roadway. You could take a truck into the building and take it up in an elevator that was big enough for an entire truck and move your goods around easily. So the competition also created innovation.
Nathan, you're in Sunset Park. What's landmarked there, or is anything kind of up for landmarking now?
In terms of along the industrial waterfront, there's nothing landmarked that I'm aware of. I live around the corner from a couple landmarks, actually, that are not industrial, but for instance, there's the old, one of the old police precincts, I'm forgetting the exact one, 17th Police Precinct, I think, is right around the corner from me. And that's a landmark that they are currently gutting, and they tore down half of what was landmarked in order to replace it with a school. So it was a landmark that had been allowed to fall into demolition by neglect, and the city has now demolished the horse stables that was attached to the police precinct and is cutting the rest of it. But yeah, along the waterfront, there's not really any industrial ones. There's very few landmarks in Sunset Park in general. It's pretty lacking in landmarks, although they just landmarked quite a few of the residences as a historic district. But along the waterfront, there's some amazing structures, including what you're seeing here, the Bush Terminal, or what's known as Industry City today, that are not protected. And further along into Bush Terminal, there's some really beautiful structures that are probably going to be demolished by the city, because the city controls Bush Terminal, or I should say the EDC.
Well, there's a big park there now.
Right, Bush Terminal Park. And we're not
even, a park.
Tonight we're not even going to get into the Brooklyn Army Terminal, which is another Cass Gilbert building, which is further down.
That's not a landmark as far as I know.
Right. And
I don't think that's landmark, is it?
That one too.
Turnstile Tours, I know, does some work down there and has more info on that as well. But as we said at the outset, the New York City waterfront, we've got another waterfront plan coming up for the next decade. So if you have input you want to give on that, you can speak with city planning about that. But we hope that this gives you some background on the history of preservation efforts, both the successes and the failures along the way. The waterfront is Whitmanic. It contains multitudes. There are so many more buildings and neighborhoods and stories to tell. But because we have now surpassed an hour in our NYPAPy Hour, we are going to go to full question and answer mode here. I'll give a sneak preview here of some other. We were going to talk about the Fulton Fish Market. We were going to talk about the misnamed gantries in the Bronx, which are actually, Mary, what's the right term for them?
Transfer bridges. Transfer
bridges, exactly. But that may have to be an entire another show sometime. So for now,
boats.
Yes, and one about historic vessels as well, and the people who have worked tirelessly to preserve them. It's a whole nother wing of the preservation story in New York City that is not often fully told. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to go back into our Hollywood Squares wonderland here, and we're going to open it up for questions for a few minutes.
Yeah, I mean, we did talk about Brooklyn, but I feel like there's plenty of room for conversations about all the other boroughs. There's so many great examples of industrial architecture in the other boroughs too that you could talk about those for a long time as well.
Absolutely.
All 5 boroughs.
All right.
Brad, hey Brad, this is this is not a question. This is just well, it's a question for you. Do you want to go into business opening a private detective agency about mysterious fires that happen in historic buildings, because
only if there's a writer, Greg, that says that I can then write a novel about what I do during that day job.
Yes, please. I mean, just that was sort of a depressing, like there's all of these buildings that are just mysteriously, I mean, the one that's not part of this because it's on industrial was this, the synagogue in the Lower East Side, which burnt down was it like a couple years ago, coincidentally right next to Essex Crossing. I mean, like, you know, anyway. So
That's
do you want to get that
historic
started?
thing.
Huh?
I mean, fire is definitely like the most dramatic way that some of these places get destroyed before landmarking. But then there's just like demolition, outright demolition, and then demolition by neglect. I wrote a whole article about things that are landmarked in New York City, but that have been left to decay to such a degree that they're collapsing because there's no real incentive to repair them. Yeah. I mean, some amazing structures that actually have been given landmark protection, but that are just crumbling to the ground because you can't compel the owner to fix them up. So it's unfortunate. I mean, I talked about the precinct right next to my house. I walked by it every day and went inside and documented it, but it was a wreck that had a beautiful exterior, and I wondered how it hadn't fallen over yet because the city had just let it decay.
Well, and a lot of these get identified when the site is being rezoned through the ULURP process with the city. So the smart thing for a developer to do is to tear it down first. Like Thor Equity did that with the Revere Sugar site.
Yeah.
Because then there's no historic structures to evaluate. Part of that process is they have to look at the impact on historic structures. And if you take it down first, it's much easier.
Or alter the outside. I know in Harlem, some of the buildings, they just altered it to such a degree that you can't, there's nothing left to preserve. You know, tear down the Lidgerwood building in Red Hook before people get around to demanding it be landmarked.
And please go clap if you have to, if you are not already doing so. Feel free. We are going to wrap up here in a few minutes. If you enjoyed what you heard tonight and had a good time and you want to leave a tip, we do aim to provide a modest honorarium for our speakers. So feel free. I will put if you just go to our website, you will see the donation at the top. It's nypap.org. But I want to thank especially our panelists this evening for a great, informative, and really educational bit on how these things happen. People might have known one or two, might have known a bunch of the stories, but this, I think, really gave a lot more color as to how things really went down behind the scenes. So thank you to Mary and to Tom and to Nathan for all of your insights.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And I'm going to unmute everyone if you do want to give a little hand to our panelists. Thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. And now for the clap outside. Bye, everybody.
Take care.